Your boss has a greater influence on your mental health than any doctor or therapist.
There's a Gallup study which says that 76% of people don't even know that they've reached burnout until it's too late. Why are people so stressed?
Modern day burnout looks different. 60% of people had an inability to disconnect from work. When you are living in stress mode, you are governed by another part of your brain. That's your stress center. 3-second brain reset. And it's my favorite technique, and we can do it together.
The American Academy of Dermatology actually said that 70% of hair loss can be linked to stress.
I was one of those patients who went to see a doctor for a stress-related condition. It took about 3 months. So I found my way out of stress, and that's when I decided you need a little bit of healthy stress to get up in the morning. Toxic resilience is what's happening a lot in the workplace. And what is toxic resilience? It's productivity at all costs.
What are some of the markers?
Based on the data, there's no such thing as mindless scrolling. It's actually a myth. It has a direct influence on your brain chemistry and your brain circuitry. Revenge, bedtime, procrastination. You've had a long day at work. You come home and then you start scrolling. The science shows that abstinence from our digital devices actually doesn't help our mental health.
Are there any quick, effective ways that people can manage that stress while in the workplace?
There are many things that you could do within seconds or minutes to start incrementally making a change. There's no such thing as multitasking. It's a scientific myth. The truth is only 2% of human brains can effectively multitask. So when you are multitasking, what you are essentially doing is...
How does stress contribute to fertility in men and women both?
Ooh, I love this question.
Welcome to Humans of Bombay Realign, Dr. Aditi. It's so lovely to be here with you in New York City.
It is such a pleasure, Karishma.
And you're amazing. Your book is a bestseller, and you talk about stress, which is, I think, one of the most relevant conversations that we can have today, especially because the burnout culture or the normalization of stress and burnout and an unhealthy way of being is completely okay, right? And it's not. So in fact, there's a Gallup study which says that 76% of people don't even know that they've reached burnout until it's too late. So what is the reason? Why are people so stressed?
That is the million-dollar question. And to answer that first point, that data point, the reason so many people don't even know that they're in a state of burnout is because modern day burnout looks different. So when you think of someone with classical features of burnout, they're apathetic, they're disengaged, they're not very motivated. We all know when you see that classic picture. But increasingly now, more than ever, we are seeing a new face of burnout, which makes it difficult to identify in ourselves and others. And this new face of burnout, modern day burnout, in one study, 60% of people had an inability to disconnect from work as their main feature of burnout. So if you are feeling a sense of burnout, and if this is you, the first thing to understand is that you are not alone and it is not your fault. Based on the data that you shared, Karishma, and all sorts of data, we know that anywhere from 50, 60 to 70% of people are facing one feature of stress and burnout. In one study in the UK, up to 90% of people were experiencing burnout just in the past month. So if you are feeling like this, understand that you are not the exception, you are the rule. That's like saying in a room of 30 people, almost 20 are facing stress and burnout right now.
That's insane. Just the number, the sheer volume of people who go through this is so concerning, right? And the thing is that it's not even defined by a demographic. It's not like age specific, it's not gender specific. It's just, it's almost like a pandemic because it's everywhere. So what and how do we understand stress at an emotional level?
So Karishma, that's a great question. And when you think about stress and burnout, the first thing that you want to think about is that what are you in normal mode, right? So before, I would say 2020, most of us were living in resilient mode. And that is governed by a part of your brain. So I won't get too scientific, but that was governed by a part of your brain here. If you put your hand on your forehead, it's the area right behind your forehead. It's called your prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex governs things like memory, planning, organization, strategic thinking, things that you and me and lots of the high achievers listening today are masters of. But something changed over the past few years, as we know, and we started getting into stress mode. When you are living in stress mode, based on the data that I just shared, most of us, the majority of us are, right? Anywhere from 50, 60, 70, up to 90%. You are governed by another part of your brain, and that is called the amygdala. It is a small almond-shaped structure deep in your brain, right above your neck, kind of like where your skull and your neck meet. You'll never think of almonds the same way again after this conversation. And so the amygdala, it's an almond-shaped structure, and its sole role is it's cave person mode, and its sole function is survival and self-preservation. And so that's your stress center, and that's what governs the fight or flight response. Now you can function for short periods of time in amygdala mode. In fact, your brain and your body are expertly designed to handle short bursts of stress. But what we're facing now, Karishma, is no longer this short stress that we come back to baseline. It is ongoing, chronic stress, one onslaught after the other. And when your brain, particularly your amygdala, can't shut that volume off, that is when burnout occurs. So it is cave person mode at all times without any stopgaps. And that is essentially what happens when you have chronic, ongoing stress. It becomes burnout. You know, when we often think about stress, we think of this like mythical, magical creature with no boundaries, and it's something that affects us. And I'm not going to be able to conquer stress because it's everywhere. It's happening all the time. But a lot of my work focuses on quantifying stress. So figuring out what are the causes of stress and actually using your brain and biology to overcome that stress and really get out of amygdala mode back to the prefrontal cortex. And you can rewire your brain, reset your stress amidst all of the chaos. You don't have to go to Bali for a 6-month surf vacation. You know, that is like ultimately my dream. You can fix your stress, reset it, and bring your burnout back into normal levels by using a lot of the strategies, because you use the science of stress to serve you rather than harm you.
Okay, so we had this question for later, but because you've mentioned it right now, what is something that, or a technique or an exercise, or I don't know what the proper terminology would be for that, but to say, calm yourself in this very moment. What can our viewers kind of do in a very hands-on way to apply this even in the future, if in an instant they want to just kind of feel that sense of peace?
Beautiful question. The first way that you can really tap into this idea of rewiring your brain for less stress, it's a 3-second brain reset. And it's my favorite technique. It's one of the first things I learned, in fact, when I was a stressed patient before I became a doctor with an expertise on stress. It's called stop, breathe, be. And we can do it together. Yeah. So what you want to do is you want to stop. Whatever you're doing, you're in a busy meeting, you're going through your workday, it doesn't matter. You know, you're rushing your kids to school. You stop, you breathe, and you just be. Stop, breathe, be. The instructions are in the name. It's a 3-second brain reset. And what it does is it gets you out of that amygdala fight or flight feeling, which, by the way, it's anxiety. It's an anxious response. It is focused on the future. Anxiety is a future-focused emotion, focused on what if. Stop, breathe, be gets you out of what if thinking and back to what is in the here and the now. And when you practice stop, breathe, be over and over and over throughout your day, ideally link it to some activity that you do habitually. So clicking join Zoom, or as you're moving from meeting to meeting, when you knock on the door and turn the doorknob as you enter the room. That's what I learned it for when I had a clinic of 30, 40 patients a day, and I would do that. It was my doorknob moment. The reason stop, breathe, be works, again, to get a little bit scientific, is because of a process called neuroplasticity. Yeah. It's a long word, but it simply means that your brain is a muscle. just like your biceps. In the same way that you can train your biceps to get stronger when you lift weights, you can do the same with your brain. You can train your brain to manage stress better using the biology of stress.
Yeah, that's, everything that you just spoke about, I think that it's the constant reoccurrence of the fact that you have to be aware that you're stressed. So when you say like a doorknob or knock or anything, right, like a Zoom tab or anything, it just reminds you that if you're feeling that sense of stress, to use that time to collect yourself. So I think that's also very, very important, just in terms of awareness. My next question is actually on the physical manifestations of stress, right? It shows up in so many different ways. Like hair loss is a big one that the American Academy of Dermatology actually said that 70% of hair loss can be linked to stress. What are the physical manifestations of stress that people can know about?
There are physical manifestations of stress, unhealthy stress, and then there are mental manifestations of stress. And so physical manifestations, honestly, Karishma, it is like head to toe. You can have hair loss, skin changes, dizziness. You can feel palpitations. That was my sign. You can have GI, stomach issues. You can feel pins and needles, fatigue in your muscles. You can be overtired. You can feel a sense of being keyed up and anxious. And then the mental manifestations, anxiety, depression, insomnia. There are so many flavors of stress, truly a million flavors of stress. What I call all of these symptoms is a canary in a coal mine. So like you say, so many people don't even realize that they're stressed, but they have a certain symptom or a sign that their body is telling them like, hey, wait a second, you're feeling a lot of stress. And canary in the coal mine, I'm not a historian, but canary in the coal mine is a really good metaphor for what's happening in your brain and your body. Mm-hmm. Back during coal miner times, humans are historically, we're very bad at knowing our limits. Yeah. And so coal miners would go down into the coal mines and take a caged bird, a canary, with them. And they would put that canary down. When the air got bad, they'd be toiling away and working. And when the air got bad, the canary would stop singing. And that was the first tell for people like, wait a second, I think the air's bad. They wouldn't necessarily feel it. And then they would get out of the mines with the canary. Mm. And that canary in the coal mine is often the first tell or that whiff of like, wait a second, is something not right? So for me, it was a sense of a stampede of wild horses. And we can talk about my personal story later. But what is your canary in the coal mine, like you, Karishma? What happens to you when you're feeling a sense of stress? Is it headaches? Is it dizziness, nausea, fatigue? We all have that thing that is a signal to us like, wait a second, hold on. I think this might be stress. And if you think about what your canary in the coal mine is, you'll probably get a good idea that no, you might never feel stressed. I've had many patients who are complaining of lots of physical manifestations or mental health manifestations, but they themselves do not feel like they are stressed. So if you say to someone, are you feeling stressed? The answer can often be no, but they are having their physical manifestations of stress. Mm-hmm. In fact, data shows that 60 to 80% of all primary care visits, so primary care, as you know, I think it might be called the same in India, right? Yeah. General medicine. Yeah. 60 to 80% of all primary care visits here in the US have a stress-related component. And yet only 3% of doctors counsel for stress. That's not to say that stress causes these symptoms, but it is a component. It is not causative, but correlated with. So let's say you're having headaches. You go to a doctor, you get a full workup. Of course, that's always very important. When you have a symptom, you can't chalk it up to saying like, oh, it's just stress. You go see your doctor, you get the workup, you get your blood work, any imaging, anything that needs to be done. And then often the doctor will say, everything checks out fine. Everything is normal. It's probably just stress. In medical terms, it's called the diagnosis of exclusion, stress. We exclude everything else and then we say, oh, it's just stress. But what is just stress? That even when a doctor says that to you, which is, by the way, what a doctor said to me when I was a stressed patient, oh, you're fine. Everything's great. Everything checked out. It's just stress. Try to relax. And so you do all the things that you think what it means to relax. You watch movies, you hang out with friends, you take trips, you try, get a massage, retail therapy. But yet none of these things actually work on the biology of the brain and the body to decrease your stress. They're wonderful. They're great Band-Aids in the moment. I mean, sign me up for Emily in Paris any day as a way to, decrease your stress. Or like we were saying earlier, Zarna, her jokes, deeply therapeutic in the moment. But when you're talking about resetting your stress and your burnout for long term, you need some real strategies like stop, breathe, be, and other things that rewire your brain through a process of neuroplasticity.
So why is it so difficult to recognize stress, and what can one do to become more aware of the telling signs? Like you mentioned a few things, right? Like fatigue or anxiety or heartburn or headache. But how can people really identify and narrow it down that, okay, this is what's happening and this is a symptom of being very, very stressed?
Think about your canary in the coal mine. Think about something that you notice. There has to be an element of self-awareness, but you can develop that sense of self-awareness with time. Next time you are getting, let's say, a headache, think of things that are surrounding it. I often, with my patients, have asked them to keep a log of, a headache log, like a tally of like, when are you feeling the symptom? What's been happening in the days prior to that symptom? Some people have a really clear understanding. They say, I get stomach pains before I give a big presentation. And then after my presentation, those pains just go away.
Yeah.
And they've gotten a workup with their doctor. And again, everything checks out fine. And so they're like, I think it could be stress. Or they get headaches when they're feeling, a sense of pressure in their workplace, etc., and then it dissipates. So think about a symptom that you may have that you think could be related to your stress, and then think about what is happening around pre and post that symptom. What's happening in your life? What's happening at work or at home? Often your body is trying to tell you something that, hey, this is something that's really happening. And, I can share my personal story. I've alluded to it, but let me just share it now. So I discovered when I was a medical resident, I was working 80 hours a week, and I was in the cardiac ICU. So I was taking care of everyone else's hearts, not really thinking about my own. And one day, post-call, it was a 30-hour call. Doctors, we are on call every third night. We sleep in the hospital. And one particular morning, after a 30-hour shift, I was rounding on my patients. And I suddenly felt a stampede of wild horses across my chest. And it quite literally knocked the wind out of me. It was terrifying. I sat down, and a nurse that I was working with, that I was very familiar with, noticed something wasn't right. I was sweating and just, out of sorts. And she quickly got me some orange juice. I drank the orange juice. And within seconds, that feeling passed. And then I got up, and I kept seeing my patients. And I went home. I never experienced the stampede of wild horses across my chest, but I experienced during work. But after that, for 2 weeks straight, right as I would go to bed, I would feel that stampede of wild horses again. And it never happened during the day. I went to go see my doctor, and my doctor did the full workup, of course, because it was my heart, right? She did the full testing, EKG, echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound of the heart, blood test for anemia and thyroid and electrolytes. Everything checked out perfectly normal. And that is when she said, it's probably just stress, and try to relax. So I was one of those patients who went to see a doctor for a stress-related condition, 60 to 80% of patient visits, right? And my doctor said, just try to relax. So when I came out of that, my first reaction was stress. Stress doesn't happen to people like me. I'm resilient. And we can talk a little bit more about that. I was living the resilience myth, thinking stress and burnout don't happen to people who are resilient. And of course, I know very much that is false and scientifically untrue. And so when I came out of that experience, I did do all of those things to just relax. Like we said, I watched movies, hung out with friends. I was single at the time, took vacations, went shopping, got massages. Nothing really worked. And when I put on my scientist hat to really dig into the science of stress and burnout and what's actually happening to your brain and your body, is when I found my way out of stress. And it took about 3 months, because for neuroplasticity to really work and for your brain to develop new pathways, it takes about 8 weeks. So giving yourself that time is really important. And so I found my way out of stress, and that's when I decided to become the doctor I really needed during that difficult time. So being a stressed patient is what helped me find my way to being an expert in stress.
Yeah. And very often it's when you experience it is that it becomes that much more important for you to resolve, right? Because you know firsthand how it feels, the just stress syndrome, so to speak.
That's right.
I'm going to go back into stress at the workplace, because I think that we spend so much of our time at work. I mean, anybody who's, I think, working at any kind of job, right? Like whether it's freelance, whether it's a corporate job, whether you have your own startup. I have my own startup, I run my own company. In different fragments, everybody feels stress. Now there's a dichotomy, right? Because sometimes it is considered, and there is a study that says it, that when you do feel that little bit of pressure, it motivates you. And it's a good kind of stress because it puts you in action mode. You kind of get things done. You fly through your to-do list, and you're on top of your game because you want to kind of use that, or you subconsciously use that as a motivator. But there's a very thin line between the two sides of the stress, which is one which can be healthy for you to motivate you to work harder and better, and the other, which is that feeling of a burnout. So how do we distinguish between the two?
Ooh, I love this question. So first, just thinking about workplace stress, understand that your boss has a greater influence on your mental health than any doctor or therapist. And most people will say that their workplace and their work and job in general, we know that data shows that about 70% of people say that their work and job is their main source of stress. So talking about stress in the workplace is more important now than ever because so many people are facing this. What you're talking about, Karishma, is two kinds of stress. So we have healthy adaptive stress, and scientifically, it's called adaptive stress. The unhealthy sort of stress, we call it, in science, we say it's maladaptive stress. So healthy adaptive stress, it's productive, it's motivating, it gets you up out of bed in the morning, it gets you engaged in the day. Now, examples of healthy stress, maybe it's getting a new job or a promotion, buying a new home, getting a new car, falling in love, having a child, meeting your new best friend, rooting for your favorite sports team. These are all examples of healthy, productive stress. They move your life forward. However, the other kind of stress that you're talking about, Karishma, is unhealthy stress. It is maladaptive stress, dysfunctional, unproductive, and it really gets in the way of you living your best life. Yeah. All of the things that we talked about before, the physical and mental manifestations of stress, when we use the word stress, like, oh, I'm so stressed, I've had such a stressful day or a stressful week or a stressful year, or for most people, like stressful 5 years, that is maladaptive, unhealthy stress that we're actually talking about. And so the goal of life is not to live a life with zero stress. It's actually biologically impossible. You need a little bit of healthy stress to get up in the morning. The goal of life is to live a life with healthy, manageable stress that can serve you rather than harm you.
Yeah. So there's a very interesting study that Deloitte did, which said that 69% of people believe that stress is needed for performance, or like heightened performance. What is your opinion? That is it necessary to be stressed to actually be able to perform and deliver at work?
I love that question, Karishma. And I would say to that, yes, a little bit of healthy stress is actually biologically important and necessary. You want to engage and be a productive citizen in this world. You want to be informed and connected. But there is a limit to that. And often, because we as humans are terrible at knowing what those limits are, we often exceed that level of healthy stress. And it's very easy to go into unhealthy stress. I would even venture to say that statistic that you shared, most of us right now are living with unhealthy stress. Very few people are feeling that sense of healthy, balanced stress that can serve you. Most of us are feeling some effects, at least one, maybe more, of maladaptive stress. And I also think that statistic and just the way it's been worded and written and the whole study really points to this idea of toxic resilience. It's especially important in the workplace. And so what is toxic resilience? True resilience, the scientific definition of true resilience, it's your innate biological ability to adapt, recover, and grow in the face of life's challenges. You can think of true resilience like when you learn to swim. Your swim instructor was a sense of healthy stress, because healthy stress and true resilience are very much combined and very much linked. Healthy stress is like that swim instructor who's encouraging you to go, keep going. Your resilience, your innate true resilience, keeps your head above water while your arms are flailing. And with time and practice, you can learn to glide through life and the sea of change. Now, when you think about true resilience, that is our innate nature. It is innately a biological mechanism of our brain and our body. It really understands human limitations, celebrates the ability to say no, and because your brain and body need biological rest as a period of recovery, it also understands boundaries and limits. Toxic resilience is what's happening a lot in the workplace. And what is toxic resilience? It's a mind over matter mindset. It's productivity at all costs. It's like all systems go all the time. So while the statistic is fascinating because it really does paint a picture of like, yes, you need healthy stress, I would veer that to say that because it is such a high number, right? You said 79%? 69%, so almost 70, like 3/4 of people almost. I would venture to say that if 70% of people are saying, yeah, you need a little bit of healthy stress, it is actually that idea of toxic resilience that, oh, you've heard the messaging. We've all heard it. It's all over in India and the US and the UK. We all have our version of toxic resilience. So in the US, we have the Energizer Bunny. Just keep going, no matter what. Just keep going. It's this bunny Energizer batteries. In the UK, keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
And so there are so many examples of toxic resilience. And it's really the messaging that you get at work. You're like, oh, I really can't take on another project. Oh, of course you can. Come on, you can do extra work. You're resilient. Or we had to shorten the deadline. Oh, you can do it. You're resilient. Or if you're a parent, to the parents listening, I'm a working mother. It's like, oh, you should be able to work like you don't have kids and parent like you don't have a job because you're resilient. And so these sorts of messages that we've received over the past several years, it's not actually scientifically true resilience. It is toxic resilience that doesn't understand boundaries or it does, it's a mind over matter mindset. And so for me, a lot of my work, in addition to stress and burnout, it's really reframing that conversation around resilience. Yeah. In my book, The 5 Resets, the full title is The 5 Resets, Rewire Your Brain and Body for Less Stress and More Resilience. And I cannot tell you, Karishma, how much I agonized about, do I put that word resilience on the cover? Because when I hear the word, it's cringeworthy. I have a visceral response because I think about when people are like, oh, come on, be more resilient. Oh, you can do it. Be more resilient. It's toxic resilience, right? So I bristle when someone says that to me. I'm like, ugh. But back, in 2015, it had a perfectly positive connotation. And so something has changed. It's morphed into something that's sinister because it has really become toxic resilience.
Right. So when it comes to identifying these patterns or these subjective nuances of what really is toxic resilience as at work, what are some of the markers that people can use to say, okay, this is the source of that kind of stress in my life, and what is it that they can do to effectively address it?
That's a great question. So, often the old understanding was that stress is short-lived. It is a blip, and then you come back to baseline. That is what the fight or flight mechanism does. Unfortunately, over the past several years, Karishma, because it has been one onslaught after the other, we don't ever really come back to baseline. So your brain and your body are not getting a rest. So what I would often say to my patients back in, 2015, 2016 is like, well, how were you a few years ago? How did you feel? And if there's a difference and a change from baseline, that is a good marker of like, wait a second, I think I might be experiencing a sense of toxic resilience or burnout. Unfortunately now, over the past 5 years or so, we have our baselines have actually changed. So we are not, because we're continually experiencing stress, we're not ever going back to baseline. Based on the data, if you are questioning, could I be stressed? Could I be feeling burnt out? Am I experiencing a sense of toxic resilience? If you are even wondering if that could be you, chances are, based on the data, 70%, in other studies, 90%, it is you. I have been hard-pressed now over the past several years. I've probably interfaced with, 100,000, probably 200,000 people in my various talks and things that I do. I have been hard-pressed to meet even one person to say, oh, you know what? I'm great. I don't have any stress. I don't have any burnout.
Wow.
Because we are all just human beings and we've experienced something individually and collectively, right? We don't have to talk about the pandemic. It is something that is very much in the past, but we are feeling the effects now, Karishma. It's because your brain is built like a dam. And what happens is during periods of acute stress, you shore up your internal reserves and you keep it together at all costs. So I give the example of my patients who've had a cancer diagnosis. They get the diagnosis of cancer. I don't see patients anymore, but when I had a busy clinical practice, they would come into my office and their doctors would say, oh, go see this doctor for stress and burnout. They would see me and they wouldn't shed a tear. They'd be like, I'm fine, doc. Everything's good. They would go through all of their treatments. I'd continue to see them. They would get all of their treatments, radiation, chemotherapy, their other sorts of counseling. And then their oncologist would give them a clean bill of health. You're great. Cancer is gone. See you in 6 months for surveillance. They would be in my office the next day, bawling, crying, because they would say, I don't know, I should be celebrating. Why am I coming to see you now? I can't keep it together. That is because your brain is built like a dam. You keep it together at all costs during periods of stress. And then immediately when the stressor is over and you feel psychologically safe, the dam breaks and all of those pent-up emotions emerge. And it can often be a deluge. And I think collectively, what so many of us right now, Karishma, are feeling, and this is globally because we went through something, right? A global experience with the pandemic, is that right now, the messaging that we're getting from our workplaces, even maybe in social settings from our families, it's like, everything is fine. Life is back to normal and just enjoy it. I remember seeing every headline over the past several years is like, oh, the roaring 20s, right after post-pandemic time, roaring 20s. It doesn't feel like the roaring 20s. And based on the data, we know it doesn't. And that is because everyone's dam has broken. And we're managing a lot of those difficult emotions now because we finally feel psychologically safe. This whole process, scientifically, it's a normal, healthy biological phenomenon. It's called a delayed stress reaction. Yeah. And it's what happened to me. When I experienced those palpitations, I would never have them during the day. Only right at night, I was relaxed. I was about to go to sleep after a really difficult day, and I would get those palpitations. So if you are experiencing any of these symptoms or feelings, understand that it is your brain doing exactly what it was meant to do. And so, often when you're feeling this way, you're thinking, oh my God, is my brain broken? Is my body broken? Something's wrong with you. No, nothing is wrong with you. Everything is right with you. Your body is processing, and the only way around is through.
Yeah. So when you speak about all of these different facets that are there, right? Like, because it can be pent up, it can be over a certain amount of time, it can be just the fact that you put up that guard that I'm okay. And I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep calm and carry on. It adds up. More so in the workspace. Not to say that it's not there at home or in your personal life or your personal relationships, but because just of the volume of time that you spend at work or the targets that you have to achieve in whichever format, it kind of builds into that. So there was a very upsetting case recently, which I'm sure you read about. It was a young chartered accountant by the name of Anna in India. And her mother wrote a very heartfelt letter saying that she was in a complete state of burnout and that she was dealing with so much pressure. But she's like, I know that this was it. And this was her first job. She was a topper. She had such a bright career, bright future, but somewhere, that kind of overwhelming sense of burnout just kind of consumed her is what is the likelihood of what happened there. How is it that people can prevent themselves from reaching a point of that kind of exhaustion and that kind of burnout?
Oh, that story it breaks my heart, truly. And we hear stories like this all the time. Public figures who seem to have it all, and they're facing their internal battles. The first, I would say, is be kinder than necessary, because everyone is facing a battle you know so little about, right? Yeah. And really, particularly with this story, I think what's really important to do is to really have a sense of open communication. It is so important. When I had a clinic in Boston affiliated with Harvard, I had a waiting room packed with patients. Everyone was silent, looking down at their phones. I would open the door, I say, come on in, or my nurse would bring the next patient in. The door would close, and that patient would burst into tears. because it was that first moment of having privacy, some alone time with me. And so many of us have a forward-facing persona. We are on at all times. Some of us, like you and I, work in front of screens, but others, you're in front of a boardroom, you're giving presentations, you're always on. And so that moment when you are off, like for that patient, so many of my patients, that door would close and they would have that moment with me. They would burst into tears. And it's because of this idea of the stress paradox, and what this tragic story really paints is this idea of a stress paradox. In that waiting room, shoulder to shoulder, everyone was struggling. This poor woman was struggling so deeply, but yet there is so much shame and taboo about stress and burnout that no one shares. And yet we are all collectively, at different levels, of course, facing these challenges, but yet we feel isolated in that experience. And it's this great paradox. You and I have shared all of the data. 70%, 90% of people are struggling. But if you were to go to your next meeting or your next social gathering, are you leading with that? Are you sharing like, oh, I've been really stressed or burned out? No, you show a different face, right? You're like, oh, I've got it all together. And so this is an extreme example of that. But it really speaks this idea of like this paradox that we are all suffering collectively. You're not the exception. You're the rule if you're feeling stress and burnout based on all of the data. And these are global figures. It doesn't really change country to country. And yet, no one shares their difficult experience. And so you can only tame it when you name it. And so we really do need to have open dialogue, communication. If you're in the workplace, we need to model behavior when it comes to leadership and changing workplace culture, and leading with that story of like, yes, I had a difficult time. I don't know what the circumstances were with this tragic case of how her workplace was or her family structure. Did she have support? But often we know that when you're feeling a sense of loneliness, and of course, when you're feeling a sense of stress and burnout, you feel exceedingly lonely. There's a lot of shame because you feel like you're going through this alone. And it's this paradox in your brain because you're thinking, oh my God, no one else is feeling this way. And if only she had been able to communicate with her friends, her family, she might have heard another story of like, yes, you know what? I feel the same way. And we call it in medicine, we call it the group effect. And it's this alchemy that happens when you are together. So if you've gone through a difficult experience and you do group therapy, what happens in group therapy, the reason it works so well is because you sit with, let's say, 10 or 20 people who've gone through the same thing. And you've lived your life, your lived experience. You've had something terrible and awful happen. And you feel so much shame. Like, oh, I'm the only one who feels this way. And then when you get together in a big group and you share your story, the person across the room says, oh my God, that happened to me too. And when you share that sense first, it normalizes your experience and then it validates your difficult experience. And so the first step when we're having this conversation about mental health, stress and burnout in the workplace, in life, in parenting, in whatever sphere, because it's really affected every single sphere. It is no longer, burnout used to be just an occupational phenomenon. It is no longer that. But when you are experiencing these difficult emotions, sharing with others helps to normalize and validate that experience, not just for yourself, for others as well. Yeah. And so we really do, like conversations like you and I have had, that you are having with other people, that is the first step, because once you remove that shame and taboo, you realize, wait a second, I'm just like everyone else and everyone is struggling. Mm-hmm. In a room of 30 people, at least 20 people are struggling with stress and burnout. You are not alone. It is not your fault if you feel this way.
Right. So when we talk about burnout, right, there are many stages of burnout. Can you highlight a few of those so that people know at what stage they're at and they can kind of take the necessary steps before it becomes a complete burnout, right, where you absolutely cannot function? What are those markers for people to understand?
So, Karishma, there are classically 5 stages of burnout. So there's the honeymoon stage, then early stress, then you become, chronically stressed, then you experience burnout, and then chronic burnout. But like I said, that is the classic picture of burnout. But now that definition has kind of been turned on its head because we know that data shows modern day burnout is really difficult to identify in ourselves and others, because one atypical feature, so classic features of burnout in this 5-stage spectrum, feeling apathetic, being disengaged, bored, unproductive. But now we're seeing new atypical features of burnout. Like in this one study, 60% of people surveyed with burnout had an inability to disconnect from work as one of their distinguishing features of burnout. So that's like saying, let's say you are an entrepreneur. I've had having a clinical practice in Boston. It is like one of the entrepreneurial capitals of the US. And I had so many patients who are entrepreneurs. And so it's this idea of like, a sprint. But really it's not really a sprint, it's a marathon. And you have to think about your end game. And so many of my patients had an inability to disconnect from work because they were always on, they were entrepreneurs, they had to build their business. So, getting on calls at 2 a.m. or 4 a.m. or 11 p.m. or going to bed at odd hours. So there has to be some sort of checks and balances system, particularly if you're eager to succeed, because your brain and your body need rest and recovery. It is actually a biological necessity. So give yourself permission if you can. A doctor is telling you that you need to take some time for rest and recovery. Understand that your brain and your body, for you to function optimally, rest is not a 4-letter word. It is a biological need, something that your body and brain require to function rather than a luxury.
But so much of this is related to boundaries and setting boundaries, right? A study by Wellnight found that 65% of people at the workplace find it difficult to set boundaries because of constant connectivity. And now, especially with like work from home or work from wherever you are in the world, you're always hooked up and always connected, which means that people find it extremely difficult to draw the line on when one can work, cannot work, what are the hours, what are not the hours. What is an effective way to set those boundaries for yourself at the workplace?
Karishma, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, digital boundaries. And so we can talk about psychological boundaries, but more so digital boundaries. So what is a digital boundary? It is simply, your brain and your body, like you said, we are hyper connected. We are always on. And when you are using your phone, which we all do at all hours, we use it all day and sometimes during the night as well, understand that there's no such thing as mindless scrolling. It's actually a myth. Because when you are scrolling, you think, oh, everyone's doing it. I'm just going to mindlessly scroll.
It's doom scrolling.
Yeah, you're doom scrolling, or you're just like at a traffic light, you're waiting to cross the street, or, worse, you're in a car driving, or you're waiting for your friend at a restaurant. And so what do? You just scroll all the time, right? We just scroll. We're like bored, you scroll. You're tired, you scroll. Nothing is mindless or harmless about scrolling, even though it is ubiquitous, meaning we all do it, because that's just how modern life is. It has a direct influence on your brain chemistry and your brain circuitry, increasing your stress. So the first boundary you can set for yourself in terms of a digital boundary is a geographical boundary. And what do I mean by that? Keep your phone off your nightstand. Where do you keep your phone? Most of us, our alarm clocks are part of your phone, right? Invest in a low-cost alarm clock. Keep your phone off your nightstand. It sounds radical. I'm not asking you to keep it in another part of your home. Just maybe on a desk or out of arm's reach. So the first thing in the morning when you wake up, whether you've had a restful night of sleep or not, you're not scrolling first thing in the morning. Data shows that more than 50% of people scroll within minutes of waking up. And that number has actually gone up when they've done studies. Last year, I think that number was something like 70% of people. I think it's underreported because I would say nearly 100% of people, if you have a smartphone, the first thing you do, often before your second eye is even open, is that you're scrolling. You're looking at your email, headlines, social media. You're just checking things. These have a direct influence on your brain. Instead, keep your phone off your nightstand. Get up. Say good morning to your bed partner if you have one. Go to the bathroom, brush your teeth. Give your brain a little respite, a digital boundary, and then check during the day. What can you do? You can keep your phone away from your workspace, either in a drawer where it's out of sight, or keep it, a little bit, if you have a larger office space, away like 5-10 feet away. The reason digital boundaries are so important is because your brain, when you are feeling a sense of stress or burnout, that amygdala mode, right? It's like on and front and center. Evolutionarily, when that amygdala, which is focused on survival and self-preservation, what that amygdala does is it scans for danger. So back when we were all cave people, the tribe would sleep and there would be a night watchman keeping guard looking around. Is everything okay? Is everything safe? Now we are all our own night watchmen. And when we scroll, when we feel a sense of stress, we scroll. We look at headlines like, are we safe? What's going on? That triggers your amygdala, and then you scroll some more and you scroll some more. Even though it doesn't feel good, you continue to scroll. And so when you keep your phone off your nightstand, keep it out of arm's reach, you're able to focus a little bit more on the here and now. And then the other boundary that I really encourage is a visual boundary. So that is turning your phone to grayscale. What often happens is when you switch your phone to grayscale, which is simply getting it out of color mode and into black and white mode, particularly at night, we can talk about why. The phenomenon is called revenge bedtime procrastination, where we can talk about why. Or even during the day when you have periods of focus. When you switch your phone to black and white, that boundary that you create automatically decreases the stimulation in your brain. Scrolling becomes less addictive. It becomes less enticing. And you're more likely to then stop scrolling and go back to your work. As one scientist mentioned, data shows that when you do grayscale, it decreases your screen time for all of these reasons. And one scientist mentioned that it's like walking through a supermarket and you see all the colorful cereal boxes and you want to eat all of those cereals. It's not good for you, but just the colors, that rich saturation of colors. But if you walk down that same aisle and saw black and white cereal boxes, you'd be like, I'm good. I don't need it. And so we know that doesn't have much nutritional value for your brain, right? Scrolling. And I brought up this idea of nighttime scrolling. It's called revenge bedtime procrastination. Again, another boundary you could set. You've had a long day at work. You come home. Maybe you have a family and you feed your kids, do bath time, and you finally have some me time. What is that time for you? So typically for me, it's like anywhere between 8 and 9. You sit on the couch, big sigh, done for the day, first moment of me time, and then you start scrolling. And before you know it, you have every intention of going to bed early. You're like, I'm going to go to bed at 10 tonight. And you go to bed at midnight or 1 or 2. And you're like, what did I do during this time? What you were doing is scrolling. You want to go to bed early and you just can't. Switch your phone to grayscale. So creating a digital boundary, whether it means keeping your phone away from you during periods of focus, and then, switching your phone to grayscale, these can be really important. It is not about becoming a digital monk, Karishma. Like, we need technology. Technology gets us connected. It's what people are listening to our conversation through technology. It's what helped you and I get connected across 2 different countries. The science shows that abstinence from our digital devices actually doesn't help our mental health, doesn't help us stress, doesn't help our burnout. Decreasing our reliance on our digital devices is what really helps. And so digital boundaries is key for that. And again, this is not about becoming a digital monk. It's just about reconsidering your relationship with technology. So when we talk about psychological boundaries, Karishma, we have all sorts of boundaries when it comes to our partners, our colleagues, our children, our family members. We've established some boundaries. And yet we have no boundaries when it comes to our relationship with our devices, porous boundaries. And so you want to create a little bit of a boundary, so think of me as like your relationship coach when it comes to the relationship between you and your phone.
Absolutely. And I feel like when you are scrolling, you think it's seemingly harmless, right? Like, what could possibly happen? It's just fun, right? Because all of the algorithms know exactly what you're looking for, and more of that shows up on your feed. All of these little things also compound into stress in the workplace, right? Because it adds varying degrees of stress. You're stressed on a work front, which is on targets and sales. When you're scrolling through, say, a LinkedIn or an Instagram, you see people's achievements. You see, oh, this person's vacationing and has that life. I don't have that life. Varying degrees of stress that compound at the workplace. I know you mentioned one technique earlier up, which is extremely amazing. When you spoke about the doorknob or the knock or the Zoom click that you can just kind of reset yourself. Are there any quick, effective ways that people can manage that stress while in the workplace and it gets very overwhelming?
Stop, breathe, be is an excellent technique that you can use in the workplace. The other thing that I would love to share, so there's so many. Essentially, when you're thinking about how you are in the workplace when it comes to stress and burnout, it's not like, oh, 5 o'clock, the workday ends. Now I'm not stressed and burned out anymore. We are all multifactorial, multidimensional creatures. And so we take our home life into our workplace and we take our work life into our home. So one thing that you can do is first and foremost, because all of these things bleed into one, especially if you're working from home or if you have a hybrid lifestyle, like over 80% have hybrid work now, it's the future of work, you can fake your commute. And what that is simply at the start of your day, what do you do when you're working from home? You get up out of bed and within minutes you are sitting at your desk, your makeshift desk, your kitchen table, your sofa, and you're in work mode. And then at the end of the day, you power down and then you go into your life within seconds. There are many benefits to hybrid work and working from home. Greater autonomy, greater productivity, less stress and burnout. But that commute that we used to take when so many of us worked in the office serves a really important role. One, geographic, gets you from point A to point B. But there's also a psychological role. It gets you out of home mode and into work mode. So those 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes that you would spend in a commute, it helps you reshift your focus, right? Away from the stressors and things that are going on at home and to get you into work mode, because we all have many different personalities and we are different. Our work self is different from our home self. So one thing that you could do if you're working from home, you have hybrid work, and you're feeling a sense of stress and burnout, this is all the time, you can begin with a fake commute. And so what does that mean? You get up in the morning, you set up your workstation, your kitchen table, your sofa, wherever you're working for the day, and then you head out. Spend 5 to 10 minutes, take a walk around the block, pick up a cup of coffee if you want, look at your calendar, your to-do list. What do you need to accomplish for the day? At the end of that, you faked your commute. Then you come back to your work space, your office, so to speak, if you're working from home, and then you start your day. At the end of the day, have a reverse fake commute and do the same thing. Pick up your dry cleaning, run an errand, go to the grocery store, and then return home. The reason this works is because your brain thrives on compartmentalization, and it really needs a sense of compartmentalization to engage in the world more fully. And so when you have this fake commute, ideally bookend your day. So at the start of your workday, have a fake commute, and at the end of your day, have a fake commute. What that does is it really honors your need, your brain's need for brain compartmentalization, while also giving you all of the autonomy, freedom, productivity benefits of working from home. Right. So that's a really important thing that you could try as a fake commute.
What about people who are at work full time, right? Because now more and more companies are calling people back to work 5 days a week at least. So what do you do at the workspace?
So it is a myth to think that you need like hours and hours of time to reset your stress and burnout and rewire your brain. Mm-hmm. There are many things that you could do within seconds or minutes to start incrementally making a change. Techniques that you can try in the workplace: stop, breathe, be. Digital boundaries, grayscale, and geographical boundaries. You can do a fake commute to and from. You can also start really honoring your breaks. So let's say you have a 5 or 10 minute break between meetings. We've talked about it. There's no such thing as mindless scrolling. And so what do? We mindlessly scroll. What can you do instead? Activate your mind-body connection. Take a walk down the hallway. Go stretch your body, do some deep breathing exercises. When you have these breaks throughout the day, and we all have them, honoring your breaks and really carving out some time for your brain and your body to recalibrate is really important. It can make a difference when it comes to your cumulative stress at the end of the day. Studies show, this one particular study from Microsoft showed brain scans of 2 groups. One group that took no breaks during the day, the second group that took incremental 10-minute breaks throughout the day. And what these researchers found is at the end of the workday, that group that took incremental 10-minute breaks had improved engagement, focus, productivity, and decreased stress and burnout. In fact, the researchers went so far as to say that these incremental breaks are a reset for your brain. And studies show that it doesn't even have to be 10 minutes, Karishma. If you're thinking like, oh my God, 10 minutes 4 to 5 times a day, I can't afford that. As many of your listeners will say, like, I can't take a break for that long. Even 10-second breaks can make a difference. In one study, this is a fascinating study that has really turned this idea of what we learn on its head. This was done at the NIH, and they studied healthy volunteers, healthy brains, and found that 10-second breaks throughout the day improved learning, And what they found is that, we are all, Karishma, you and me and everyone else, we're engaged in our workday. We're learning new tasks all the time. We're expected to learn lots of new things. You think it's actually during practice that you're learning the tasks, but in fact, new learning happens at rest. And this study showed that even these 10-second breaks, that learning occurred during these breaks and not while they were engaged in the task. And researchers said that resting early and often is critical to new learning. And so really honoring those breaks, reframing the conversation about rest and recovery and what it actually means for your brain. Because what's good for your body is good for your brain and vice versa. Your brain, the human brain, is expertly designed to handle short bursts of stress, but it desperately needs a time of recovery. Right. And then the final strategy that I would love to offer, again, this is something that many of your listeners who are type A personalities, go-getters, are going to say, what? Avoid multitasking. That, is one of the most important strategies to decrease your stress and burnout. So you've heard the term multitasking. You likely think you're an excellent multitasker. I am a recovered multitasker. Even though 100% of us think that we are excellent multitaskers, the truth is only 2% of human brains can effectively multitask. And so 98% of us are struggling with multitasking. In fact, your brain is wired to do one thing at a time. There is no such thing as multitasking. It's a scientific myth. It's a scientific misnomer. So when you are multitasking, what you are essentially doing is called task switching, doing two separate tasks in rapid succession. And because your brain is wired to do one thing at a time, you really can only focus on one thing at a time. So when I offer stop multitasking and the antidote, which is monotasking, doing one thing at a time, when I share that with various audiences, people are like, there's no way. So how can you bring the element of the science of monotasking into your work life that has so many demands on your time and your attention? You can do something which I like to do and I have done for years. It's time blocking. And so what you do, let's say you have 4 tasks to complete, 4 different projects you're working on. The old you might have said, I'm going to do all of them all at once. So the reason you don't want to multitask or what we, task switch, the reason you don't want to multitask is because remember we talked about the prefrontal cortex at the start of our conversation, the area right behind your forehead that governs memory, planning, organization. It also governs complex problem-solving skills. And when you multitask, you actually weaken your prefrontal cortex, believe it or not. And so you want to preserve your prefrontal cortex. That's an important part of your brain. And so when you multitask, you're decreasing the effectiveness of your prefrontal cortex. And ironically, multitasking makes you less productive, even though we think it's supposed to make us more productive. Yeah. So monotasking is the antidote, doing one thing at a time. And so time blocking, it's a workflow that you can use. I used it when I wrote the 5 resets. I learned it early in my medical training because when I was a first-year medical student, I had 5, 6 different subjects and I had to bring into my brain copious amounts of information. And so what you do with monotasking, time blocking, what you do is you spend, let's say you have 4 projects that you need to complete. Give yourself, if you need like 2 hours and you want to make headway on them. You might have said, I'm going to do all 4 of these things all at once. Focus on task 1 and do it for anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes. Set a timer if you have to. Then take a short 2 to 5 minute break. Then start with task 2. Again, 15, 20 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Take a short 2 to 5 minute break. The same for task 3 and task 4. When you practice time blocking in this way, what happens is that you preserve your prefrontal cortex. You make headway on all 4 of your tasks, but you don't compromise your productivity and you decrease your sense of stress and burnout. So it's a learning curve. When I first learned to monotask, now I am an expert monotasker and I wear that as a badge of honor rather than multitasking, which was like the old way that I used to think like, oh, I can get so much done. When you do monotasking, what happens is you start small. So give yourself, 5-10 minutes in the beginning, because it's a learned and practiced skill. You're creating those brain pathways through neuroplasticity. And so give yourself 5 or 10 minutes and you do this, and then you take a small break and you continue to increase those increments. So now I can work probably, Karishma, a total of 50 minutes straight through until I need to take a break.
Right.
And those breaks, again, we talked about the value of those breaks and the biological necessity of those breaks. And so when you use monotasking and honor your breaks at the same time, that is like the winning ticket for productivity and decreasing stress and burnout at the workplace.
Absolutely. So when we flip the conversation, right, like we're speaking on the employees end, where you have to kind of structure your day, take those breaks, you want to kind of be more mindful of your boundaries. But what can be done at the corporate policy level, right? Like you've interfaced with so many different people, you've interfaced with different companies, and spoken about stress in the context of both sides, right? So different things, say flexible working hours. We just spoke about hybrid. There are mental health days now that a lot of corporates are implementing. There are also on-site therapists that are available right there in case you feel that level of anxiety and stress and workout. In your opinion, what are some of the things that large corporations can do to make their workspaces a little less stressed and a little more productive and resilient in the good way?
What can you do? The first thing you can do, and we are all leaders in some capacity, we're all people managers in some capacity. First is to really think about reframing that conversation away from toxic resilience and back to true resilience. When I think about doing that, there are 5 key strategies to really become a truly resilient leader through these changing times. The first very important strategy is to over-communicate about mental health in the workplace. We shared that tragic story of that woman who committed suicide. Over-communicating about mental health is really the way forward. Understand that in your employee base, 7 out of 10 people are struggling and have said, based on the data, that it's been the most difficult time of their entire professional careers, the last few years. So over-communicating is really important. The second is, like you say, create some programs. So informal programs, peer support groups that really speak to this idea of the group effect and normalizing and validating the difficult experience, and more formal counseling programs. Again, like you mentioned, making sure that both of these programs, the key is that they are free, well advertised, and confidential. The other thing that you want to do is to model healthy behavior if you're a leader. Avoid early morning meetings. Avoid late night emails. What I've seen lately is a lot of leaders, because I communicate with a lot of the top leaders in the world, right? I see their outgoing messages below their signature. It says, I am sending this at a time that is convenient for me. It might not be convenient for you. Please feel free to respond at a time that's convenient for you. That's a really wonderful message that you're sending out. So if you are a leader, think about modeling healthy behavior for yourself and how you are as a role model at work, and your employees will follow suit. Next, really lean into this idea of creating a culture of psychological safety and transparency. We've shared a lot of these strategies, and psychological safety is something that we really do understand, and many corporations are speaking about this. And finally, lead with compassion and empathy. These are not soft metrics. The data shows that compassion can actually change the brain. It changes your amygdala. Yeah. It decreases cortisol, increases oxytocin, both self-compassion and compassion for others. We also know that based on the data, engaged employees are 20% more profitable than their counterparts. So these are not just soft, nice to have things, they influence your bottom line. We know that when an organization's culture and their mental health programming is aligned with employee experience, that's when mental health, stress and burnout, productivity can all be optimized.
So when you bring it closer to home, when you bring it to women specifically, there's a study in The Diplomat that says that women in India are more likely to perform 10 times more unpaid domestic labor than men. And that effectively leads to the struggle of balancing the home and the workplace. And as somebody who, so I live by myself, I run my own house, I don't have children, but very often, when you're juggling both home, which is considered the woman's domain, the children are considered the woman's domain, but also work, because especially in the India that's upcoming, both partners are contributing to the household. The woman is not in a position to give up that money, to give up the job, but at the same time, everything that you see at home is the domain of the woman. What is the boundary that women can set to maintain that level of not just work-life balance or balancing home and work, but a degree of sanity, right? Because you possibly can't do everything, and it is almost normalized to expect the woman to do it.
Beautiful question, and it hits like deep in my soul because I am a working mother, and my husband is also a working person, and so I really think very much about this. The first thing I will say, and I also wanted to mention this because you triggered an idea in my head when you said, Indians are wired to do certain things. In the same way, we often hear like, oh, women, you're just better at it. You're wired to do these things at home. And I would enthusiastically like to debunk this idea of wiring that it's a societal construct to be just wired to be better. Indians, you're just wired to be better in certain things. No, it's the societal pressure. Or with women, you're just wired to. We know all of the data, right? Especially Indian women. 70% of Indian women feel stressed at work compared to a very disproportionate number of men. So we know across all countries that women are struggling with stress and burnout higher. But in India, particularly when I was researching for our conversation, one of the statistics that was quite astounding is that 70% of Indian women are struggling with stress and burnout in the workplace. And this was a gender-specific study. We know that there are no real differences in terms of being wired. Oh, women are just better at multitasking. How many times have we heard that, right? Oh, we're just better at it. No, it's that we are socialized and almost forced to be better at certain things. So understanding that there are societal pressures and norms, I hear that very much. And so what can we do? We can start talking about this. Conversations like you and I are having today. Over time, that creates a culture change. Over time, that creates a policy change. We know that when it comes to caregiving stress, particularly, this is a real clinical entity. It's not just oh yeah, I'm stressed because I'm being a primary caregiver and bringing home income in my household. Caregiving stress has a real effect on your brain and your body. We also know that when workplaces focus on caregivers, 80% of people are caregivers, whether you're caring for children, elderly parents, we're all caregivers in some capacity. When you focus on caregivers, we know that caregivers also say that, of course, caregiving impacts my productivity. Of course it does. When I'll give you a very clear example. Yesterday, my own personal example, I was at the airport. I had a talk that I was giving. And as I was getting into my car at an airport in another city from where I live, I was calling my daughter's school, making sure that everything was okay and she was going to get picked up on time, etc. My husband was at home. And he was working, of course, but he was local. But it just fell to me as the mom and the woman of the home to make those decisions. Women are constantly put under different lenses. And so my first sort of strategy is to first normalize and validate the experience. It's not in your head. It's not oh, I should be able to handle all of this. No, this is toxic resilience, right? It's the resilience myth that oh, I'm resilient. I can't get burned out. Of course you can, because you are having impossible demands put on your time, attention, resources, mental bandwidth. And so the first is to just acknowledge, normalize, and validate this experience. And then the second is to create policy change. We have to have policy change in the workplace, at home. And then over time, when you're thinking about short-term, medium-term, long-term goals, the ultimate goal is that we change culture. And that will come. And so what I like to do is when I think about the difference, women are disproportionately impacted. What I like to think about is yes, culture change will come It's people, very smart people all over the world are working on parental leave and lots of other policies that make change possible, right, for women in the workplace. In the meantime, you don't want to gaslight your lived experience. You want to be able to have good experiences. You want to be able to decrease your stress and burnout in the now, so that 20 years from now, when there's a policy change, it's not then that you're thinking, okay, I'm going to work on this. Do it now. Use the tools in the 5 resets and the stuff that we've talked about today to rewire your brain and body to decrease your stress and burnout now. But do not forget that, yes, in fact, it is not in your head, that it is a societal phenomenon that we all have to really work on.
Yeah. So in that context, in your book, you talk about the whole person approach, where it's not just a factor, it's a combination of emotional, physical, and mental well-being that contributes to a more holistic way of mitigating or managing stress. How do you kind of work on all these 3 aspects to manage chronic stress in a very sustainable way? Like, you can do these quick fix exercises, but it really does take work to make it holistic and long lasting.
That's a beautiful question. I love the way you asked it. You know, when it comes to your brain and your biology, your brain and your body, when it comes to your brain and your body, they work together. It's the mind-body connection. What's good for your body is good for your brain. What's good for your brain is good for your body. And there's a lot of crosstalk. And so the mind-body connection is kind of the premise. In addition to neuroplasticity, the mind-body connection is the premise of what all of my strategies always include. I would say that if you want to be holistic, you can be holistic and have a holistic effect, but you have to start small and incrementally. So just start small. Aim for digital boundaries like we talked about. That has an effect on your brain and your body. It will influence how you are at home. It will influence how you are at work, because we are just like one ball of connectivity. When you look at, I've dissected human bodies, right? In medical training, we are all just made of the same stuff, and we truly are all very much connected. Internally, there's a lot of interconnection. So when you focus on one thing, for example, one really simple technique is to just aim for movement, some form of movement every day. It doesn't have to be like you have to go to the gym and work out for an hour, because often we have that all or nothing fallacy with exercise. We know that daily movement requires some level of commitment. When you are thinking about stress and burnout, often the gap isn't about knowledge and information. You know you should get to bed early. You know you should try to move your body a little bit every day, that it would help you. You know that you should manage, maybe get off your phone. The gap is never about knowledge and information. We know what to do with all of my patients. The gap is often with action. It's like, how do you get there from where you are? And so one strategy that I often offer is the most goal. So it's a strategy that I've used with many of my patients. Instead of saying to yourself, what's the matter with me? Instead, reframe that question and say, what matters to me most? M, is it motivating? Does it help get you up out of bed in the morning? O, is it objective and measurable? We talk about stress being this nebulous thing. Is this thing that you're going to do something easy to measure? S, is it small? Can you virtually guarantee its success in the short term? And T, is it timely? In 2 to 3 months, remember, it takes 8 weeks to build a habit in your brain. Knowing that falling off and getting back on is part of habit formation. So can you achieve this goal, this most goal, what matters to you most, in the next 2 to 3 months? When you're thinking about a holistic perspective and achieving this most goal, it's not something big like, what's my purpose in life? It's like, I want to sleep earlier. I want to have more energy. I want to be able to play with my kids. Or if you don't have kids, and if you're like, I want to look for a new job. I don't like my job. But you need a certain level of energy and bandwidth to look for that new job, right? When you're feeling a sense of stress and burnout. So when you create a most goal, what you do is you create some sort of framework to then help you achieve that goal. The other strategy that I offer once you have your most goal is to have a backwards plan. We talked about this idea of having a gap in action. It's not a gap in knowledge or information. So how do you get there? So the reason is because when you're feeling a sense of stress and burnout, you are living in the immediate terms. By design, your brain is not thinking about 2 weeks from now or a month from now. Your amygdala is thinking about survival and self-preservation, like right here and the now. So how do you get out of that amygdala mode back to the prefrontal cortex, back to that idea of strategic thinking? You have to get out of your own way. And you can do that using a backwards plan. So let's say you have your most goal. You're like, oh, this is what I want to achieve. This idea of like a holistic, something that you want to achieve for yourself. You put that, you take a piece of paper, you write it on the top. At the bottom, you write start and today's date. At the top, when you have your most goal, a goal 2 to 3 months in advance, in the future. And right below your most goal, what are you going to achieve right before that step? Below that, what's that thing that you're going to achieve? Go down the page. Your backwards plan is an incremental, stepwise way to get you out of amygdala mode and back to your prefrontal cortex. When you have that piece of paper, put it up in your refrigerator. Put it up somewhere where you can see it. So when you see it, you can be it. And what that does over time is it makes it concrete. It helps you get out of that amygdala mode back to the prefrontal cortex. Yeah. So those are 2 other strategies that I have used personally. And my most goals have changed, like sometimes my most goal is different professionally or personally. But when you work backwards, it's easier. Didn't Soren Kierkegaard say, life can only be understood backwards, but it is lived forwards. Yeah. And so that's kind of the way I do it.
So it's interesting you say that because, when you have an actionable step and you make it easy and it's not like a mountain to climb, it almost becomes psychologically so much more achievable. And you're also motivated to do it more. Like if you give me a mammoth task, I'm just like, oh my God, like this is just going to take forever. And I'm like stressed out already before even beginning it. But when you break it up into micro tasks, it's just more consumable and edible in that form. So, when it comes to holistic kind of solutions to chronic, to dealing with chronic stress or other forms of or other manifestations of stress, like anxiety or just that feeling of a complete burnout, a lot of people have been speaking about integrating practices from the East and the West as like a confluence in terms of a solution that you can offer people. So I just want your opinion on them, and I'll read out what they are, and you can tell me if it's effective, if so, what's the best way to practice, and we can take it from there. Great. So the first one is mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy.
Love that. So for mindfulness is different than cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. I'm actually a mindfulness instructor, and I've been a longtime meditator, like over 25 years. Meditation was my first foray into stress management. So I really understand why people would want that. We know that data shows, particularly with mindfulness meditation, that this very new study that just came out, which showed that as a first-line treatment for mild anxiety and moderate, not severe, but mild to moderate anxiety, meditation was found to be equivalent to taking an SSRI. So that's a selective serotonin receptor antagonist. It's like SSRI are like things like Prozac and other sorts of medications that people may recognize. And so that was a really interesting finding, because it might have implications for insurance companies or what doctors prescribe patients, etc. So yes, I think the first step is always see your doctor. Because you might think, oh, this is garden variety stress and burnout, and it might be masking an underlying medical condition that needs attention. So don't just self-diagnose and say like, it's probably just stress and burnout. See your doctor. There might be lots of true medical conditions that mimic stress and burnout. Stress is a diagnosis of exclusion. So you want to get that all worked up, and then the doctor says, oh, it's just stress, quote unquote, what my doctor said to me. So mindfulness training, meditation, very much proven to help with stress. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, an excellent technique, and you would use that with a therapist. You would see a therapist. A lot of the things that we've talked about today, Karishma, actually change your brain. They rewire your brain, and they change that prefrontal cortex. Meditation is one. It thickens your prefrontal cortex. Data has shown in 8 weeks. It's called mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's a program that I was trained in, and it changes your brain. So does CBT. It also changes your brain. It just goes to show that when you do these various things, and we can keep going down the list, that your brain is not like a grab bag. I think that's also something important to know, that a lot of people will say like, oh, the brain you got at birth was the brain you got for life. Instead, you can kind of rethink that because your brain is a muscle, just like your bicep. And you can train your brain and rewire it in different ways and strengthen certain areas, like exercise can also be helpful. It fattens up the area of your brain called the hippocampus. So when you're doing things throughout your day, understand that everything you do can help or hurt your brain. And so, yes, mindfulness, CBT, wonderful techniques for stress and burnout.
Awesome. What about Ayurveda and nutrition?
It's interesting because when it comes to Ayurveda, we do not have here in the West the NIH. It's a group called the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. It's one of the arms of the National Institutes of Health. Here in the US, we don't have robust data for Ayurveda. I know in India, they've done lots of studies on various Ayurvedic techniques and nutrition. Nutrition is very important. The reason nutrition is important is because of the gut-brain connection. Is an offshoot of the mind-body connection. We now know that the gut-brain connection, it's your gut is sending signals to your brain and vice versa. Now your gut, when you and I are saying gut, it's not digestion. It's about other things in your gut. So a medical term, it's called the microbiome. It's like an ecosystem in your gut. Trillions of healthy bacteria that live in your gut. And they do lots of things besides digestion. They regulate your mood, your energy. They regulate glucose control. I feel like every week there's some new data about the gut-brain connection. And most recently, there's a fascinating early emerging field called not just the microbiome, but a bunch of bacteria in your gut called the psychobiome. And the psychobiome, they're only focus is mood regulation. And so when you eat, I talk about it in the 5 resets. Mediterranean diet is it's often the gold standard for eating because it is truly a diet that has been studied over and over again. It's not really a diet, it's about a way of life, and eating plant-based and mostly, there's a whole method to that. Yeah, but you can read about, but you can bring in elements of the Mediterranean diet. We know that helps with stress and burnout. So you are what you eat. And so really thinking about what you're eating and fostering the gut-brain connection, strengthening your microbiome, prebiotic foods, probiotic foods. And it's a real hot topic in terms of research here in the West, at least, when it comes to stress and burnout. The mind-body connection, the microbiome, and the psychobiome.
Okay, very interesting. Last few questions, one of which is, how does stress contribute to fertility in men and women both? Like, how is it a factor?
Ooh, I love this question. I will say that it is so easy for the blame to be placed on stress. I'm not an OBGYN and I don't practice fertility as a practice. My background is in internal medicine and integrative medicine. I'm dual board certified in both. I would like to say to those people who are struggling with fertility and who also feel a sense of stress, and they've been told, decrease your stress, or that your stress is causing your fertility problems. I really have a lot of compassion for people who have been taught that or who've been told that, because unfortunately, then that goes back to you, right? The onus and the burden of responsibility goes on you to, if only I was less stressed, then I would be able to conceive. I think that there needs to be a lot of compassion there and a lot of gentleness with that conversation, because I don't agree with that. I don't think that it's, because ultimately then that doctor is telling that patient, it's your fault. And that is unequivocally just, in my opinion, wrong. And it should be a partnership between the patient and the doctor. But yes, of course, I think stress can influence all aspects of life, but it is not the cause, right? So it's helpful for us all, you and I and everyone listening, to manage our stress and burnout, because it will just help optimize your brain and your body and your spirit to really thrive. But, I always pause when people start blaming individuals, because I think it is a dangerous game and I don't think that's appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. That's amazing. I have the last question for you. We've spoken for a couple of hours now and we've discussed...
It went in like minutes, Karishma. You're so amazing.
Thank you. We've discussed so many things about stress, from the causes to what one can do to kind of lower them, different techniques that you've been very kind to share. Also, some of the myths that have been busted, different techniques. But to summarize, if there was one thing that people can do to reduce their stress right now, just one thing, what would it be?
If there is one thing you can do to feel less stressed and burnout, is first and foremost practice self-compassion and be gentle with yourself on this journey to recovery. Understand that you are not alone. It is not your fault. We are all struggling in some capacity based on all of the data that Karishma, you and I shared, with stress and burnout. And leaning into this idea of being gentle with yourself as you are going through the journey is perhaps the most important. This is not a nice to have. We know that it actually changes your brain. But so often when we're feeling a sense of stress and burnout, we shame ourselves. We get angry with ourselves. What's the matter with me? I should be this way, should be that way. Stop shoulding all over yourself. And instead, just embrace this idea that you are a whole person and you are a human being, and you are having a normal experience to these very abnormal situations.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been lovely. I learned a lot, and I hope that our viewers learn from you as well. And we're going to link your book down below so that anybody who wants to learn to manage stress better can go and purchase it. And I hope this is one of many more podcasts to come, Dr. Aditi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You know, I'm such a fangirl of yours. So joining you in conversation was truly one of the great highlights for me. Thank you.
That's amazing. So maybe hopefully we'll have a part 2 and a part 3 to this.
Oh, that would be great. You're so great. You're such a great interviewer. And I think one of the things that I admire most about you is that you've developed this huge following and with Humans of Bombay and this podcast. And I think you really practice all of those things, Karishma, like your sense of, you're a student and you're curious, but I think you also practice this idea of humanism and leaning into your authenticity and vulnerability and leaning into that and sharing that. So when your audience sees you sharing those stories, they feel a sense of courageousness and bravery to share their own. And that's how you change culture and conversation.
Thank you so much. And it's been an absolute pleasure, and my absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you.
The feeling is so mutual.
Thank you. We hope this episode added value to your lives. Join the Realign movement. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you in the next one.